To be completely honest, there was a bit of hesitation for me to play through and make a video over Bioshock 2. I mentioned in my video about the first Bioshock that I look back on my first playthrough of it quite fondly, both in the initial experience of Rapture, but more notably, being mesmerized by the narrative. Oddly enough, I actually played Bioshock 2 fairly soon after playing through the first, closer to when it originally came out. However, and this is the cause for my initial reluctance, if you had put a gun to my head a week ago and asked me what the storyline for Bioshock 2 was, or even memorable moments from the game, I would have drawn a total blank. That isn't to say that Bioshock 2 is a bad game by any means. Quite the contrary, I had a lot of fun with my recent playthrough. However, especially towards the beginning of the game, I was concerned that I wouldn't have much to say about it in terms of the story. That is, until I started to think about the differences in game mechanics between the original and its sequel, and more noticeably, how those mechanics made me feel as I trudged through Rapture once again. Furthermore, upon this realization, it opened my eyes to all the ways that Rapture has changed between games, and perhaps more surprisingly, all the ways that Rapture has stayed the same. Just like my video about the first game, I feel obligated to give a spoiler warning for both Bioshock and now Bioshock 2. Even though the games have been out for quite a while, I don't want you to feel blindsided by me casually discussing the major narrative points of one or both games. When I first started writing this script, I originally wanted to discuss the mechanical differences between Bioshock and its sequel, because ultimately I think the gameplay improves a lot between the two. However, most of these comparisons aren't exactly relevant when discussing the narrative. That said, there is one crucial contrast that ultimately altered how I viewed the world of Rapture and how I interacted with it. This change isn't one that immediately stuck out to me either. The way you hack machines is different. You can wield plasmids and weapons at the same time instead of having to switch between the two, but the change that I think is more important wasn't obvious to me from the start. In fact, I noticed the effect of the change before I identified the cause. After a few hours of gameplay, I realized that, compared to my playthrough of Bioshock, I was noticeably less afraid while playing the sequel. Both of these games fall into the category of the horror genre, with their design and atmosphere being generally unsettling and creepy. Additionally, when it comes to horror, I am a bit of a wimp. Horror is definitely one of my favorite genres when it comes to gaming, but that doesn't mean I necessarily always face it with bravery. Yet, here I was, walking around the sinister scenery of this dystopia without a care in the world. At first, I chalked this up to the fact that I had just played through Bioshock the week before, and I was either more confident in my capabilities, or perhaps I was becoming numb to the shocking reality of this world. Earlier, I alluded to the fact that I remembered very little of my first playthrough of Bioshock 2, but one thing I do distinctly remember was that I found the sequel significantly less scary. I didn't magically become a courageous hero within the span of a week. It was the same underwater city with the same splicers, yet I was charging into danger with little to no fear. I specifically recall 2 instances within my playthrough where a splicer appeared out of nowhere and slinked away, or popped up in my face for a jump scare. Both times it was obvious that these moments were meant to invoke fear in the player, yet my 2 responses were, "Get back here and fight me," and "Yeah, you better run." This speculation led me to the logical conclusion that something within the context had changed, and then it just clicked in my head. I think the reason for my newfound audacity was in the simple fact that who I was playing in the game had changed. In Bioshock, before you know the twist revealed towards the end, you play as someone who has seemingly just found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. You're subjected to Rapture due to circumstance, equipped at first with just a wrench to defend yourself. In contrast with Bioshock 2, you're playing as a big daddy. These behemoths have been shown in the previous game to be a force to be reckoned with. In fact, these fights are some of the toughest in the game. With a drill attached to my hand and plasmids flowing from the other, I had a real, "I'm not locked in here with you, you're locked in here with me" moment. A genuine feeling of, I am not in danger, Skylar, I am the danger. I was no longer an innocent bystander trying to survive a nightmare, I was now one of the monsters that made this wasteland so dangerous. However, in reality, you're not really stronger as Delta for this game than you are as Jack for the first. You don't have more health or take less damage overall. For the sake of gameplay alone, you're essentially the same entity. Sure, there could be arguments to be made between the differences in weapons, or perhaps being able to use plasmids at the same time as your guns objectively makes you more deadly, but I don't believe these are the reasons for my new resolve. I watched Big Daddies take on groups of splicers with ease, barely even taking damage, and I genuinely think that my brain just accepted that I was this strong as well. Earlier, I mentioned that this contrast not only changed how I interacted with Rapture, but also how I viewed it. While I juggled back and forth with this hypothesis to explain my lack of fear, I tried to identify and eliminate other factors that could have possibly been an explanation. The splicers were still deranged and psychotic, the atmosphere was still chilling and gruesome. The only change I could identify was the one difference in the protagonist, because ultimately, Rapture itself hadn't changed. That's when the little light bulb went off in my little brain. Rapture hasn't changed. The underwater city is still falling apart, with water pouring into every room around every corner. Every area is still filled with bloodthirsty crackheads ready to jump me on sight. Perhaps I was too busy punching splicers in the face with my big old drill, but while I had been trudging along in my big old diver boots, I didn't have this realization till I pondered about my lack of fear. But upon noticing the lack of change, quite frankly, it didn't make any sense to me. How could this place feel so similar, especially when this establishment is technically under new management? Bioshock 2 takes place 8 years after the ending of the first game. That's 8 years of Andrew Ryan and Fontaine both being dead. With their leadership gone and presumably a power vacuum formed, in their place rose Dr. Sophia Lamb. Lamb is the main antagonist of Bioshock 2 and acts as the indisputable narrative foil for Andrew Ryan, her whole philosophy being mirrored throughout the game. While Ryan was a believer in objectivism and the importance of individualism, Lamb argues back with collectivism and the importance of self-sacrifice. Interestingly enough, a lot of the game's story has a surprising amount of Andrew Ryan and his philosophy in it, despite him no longer being around. There's a whole section of the game that is set up somewhat like Disney World, but instead of it just being fun rides, it's Ryan's philosophical propaganda in the form of playful and charming animatronic set pieces. It's akin to the It's a Small World After All ride, but with a clear ideological agenda. At first, it was a bit surprising to me how much of Ryan's philosophy was on display for the player in the game where he had been dead for nearly a decade. But I believe that it's just so blatantly exhibited to further push the contrast between Andrew and Dr. Lamb. Dr. Lamb is driven by a singular obsession of creating a utopian world, thinking that Adam is the key to changing humanity. More specifically, to use Adam to alter her daughter into some kind of selfless messiah figure that she refers to as a utopian, or the people's daughter. Unfortunately for Dr. Lamb, her daughter Eleanor was not only a little sister at one point, but was more importantly, the player's little sister. We take the role of a Big Daddy, more specifically an Alpha Series Big Daddy named Subject Delta. Alpha Series Big Daddies were the first protectors to successfully bond with their little sisters, but with a major flaw. Not only did they bind to a single little sister, but separation from that little sister would cause them to lapse into a coma or even die. After waking from a little nap caused by none other than Sophia Lamb herself, we are immediately flung into conflict with Dr. Lamb. Our main goal being to reunite with and protect Eleanor, and her mother's main goal being to genetically alter her despite her daughter's wishes. Of course, this leads to fights with splicers, other Big Daddies, recruiting little sisters to gather Adam, choosing how to deal with those little sisters, and superpowers and guns. All the while, Dr. Sophia Lamb can be heard preaching her ideals through the speakers to the remaining inhabitants of Rapture, who have bought into her philosophy of collectivism and now refer to themselves as the family. These high and mighty sermons push the ideals of the common good above all else, that the needs of the community outweigh the desires of the individual. In fact, before his death, Dr. Lamb was actively outspoken against Ryan and debated him publicly, challenging his ideology. Needless to say, Delta's selfish desire to reunite with and protect Eleanor flies in the face of everything that Dr. Lamb preaches. We are a walking, breathing, and fighting refutation of everything that she stands for, with the sole purpose of foiling her machinations. However, despite us being the metaphorical wrench within her plans, it's plain to see that her philosophy and leadership has not left Rapture better off than in the days of Andrew Ryan. I said in my last video that the opening to Bioshock is so gripping because it displays Andrew Ryan's philosophy in a bombastic and pompous fashion just to have the reality of his society slapped across your face. Here, it's been literal years under this new doctrine, teaching the people to deny the self and live for the greater good, and yet Rapture is still a nightmarish wasteland. The infrastructure of the buildings is seemingly moments away from collapse. There are splicers around every corner, still deranged and ready to murder and steal to get ahead. Most surprising of all, there are still little sisters gathering at 'em while being accompanied by big daddies. Weapons, crucial medical supplies, and even food still have to be purchased from vending machines. There aren't any new plasmids that heal injured allies or grow crops for the betterment of the community, just the same old gosh darn bees. You may currently be arguing in your head that perhaps Rapture was too far gone to be saved, or perhaps Dr. Lamb's creed has fallen on deaf ears. However, most of the splicers are regurgitating her rhetoric and follow her every command like good little sheep. No, it's obvious that regardless of the leadership and the ideology set in place, Rapture still remains desolate and dangerous. When I was doing a bit of research for my video over Bioshock, I came across an interview on the website Shacknews. This interview was with Ken Levine, the creative director for the game. I found the interview fascinating and will link it down below for those interested, but there is a palpable quote that, while in reference to the first game specifically, I think it fits for every game within the Bioshock universe. I paraphrase the question about whether Ken thought he gave objectivism a bad look in the game, with Ken responding, and I quote directly here, "It's not an attack on objectivism. It's a fair look at humanity. We screw things up. We're very, very fallible. You have this beautiful, beautiful city, and then what happens when reality meets the ideals? The visual look of the city is the ideals, and the water coming in is reality." It could have been objectivism. It could have been anything. It's important to note here that Ken Levine and his team didn't actually make Bioshock 2. It was developed by 2K Marin. However, despite the differences in developers, I find that it does an excellent job staying within the idea it could have been objectivism, it could have been anything. This quote has single-handedly made me view the entire Bioshock trilogy in a new light. It's very easy to fall into the trap of seeing each game as a critique on a different ideology. I first saw these games just as that. Bioshock? Objectivism and capitalism bad. Bioshock 2? Collectivism and communism bad. Bioshock Infinite? Religion and nationalism bad. While I didn't necessarily agree with all of those statements, that is initially how I viewed the points of the narrative, but now I see it as more of a commentary on the human condition. In these three games, different philosophies are kind of plugged into the equation, but the outcome of society doesn't seem to be objectively better in one game than the others. The common denominator between the three is humanity. Even the protagonists we play, the heroes, at times seem outside of these systems or perhaps act as an objective third party to them, but they are eventually revealed to be tied up in the mess just as much as everyone else. Of course, this is a pretty cynical and pessimistic critique of humanity. Furthermore, these philosophies and ideologies are shown to be at their most extreme degrees. However, even with the commentary being completely polarized between Ryan and Lamb, we have very similar results. Sophia Lamb, who is aptly named, pretends to be one of the flock, all the while using and sacrificing her fellow men and women like cattle. They praise and worship her as a savior and shepherd, and despite all of her soapbox sermons or lofty rhetoric, she knowingly and willingly sends them to their slaughter. Make no mistake, as Subject Delta, we are definitely playing the role of the big bad wolf, acting as a significant threat in her paradoxical paradise. But if she were a part of the flock as she claims to be, then why isn't she here? Alongside her comrades in arms, ready to fight me head on. She even plans to use her daughter as the prime experiment rather than herself. You would think that someone who preaches rejecting the self non-stop would be the first to voluntarily destroy themselves for the greater good. For all of her hatred of Ryan and his beliefs, she hasn't made any real progress in reviving Rapture or its people. The metaphorical pendulum has swung so far in the opposite direction that the world eerily looks exactly like it was before. Going back into this series, I genuinely didn't think that I would have such a new outlook on it or glean so much information this time around. Moreover, I have really enjoyed my time just playing through these games again. I say all this to explain that I will definitely be playing Bioshock Infinite and making a video about it as well. I've come to a realization that ties all three games together in a way that I'd never noticed before. Obviously, I won't reveal that now, but will save it for the next video. So if you don't want to miss it, then consider subscribing to the channel. It helps me out a ton. I love video games and I love talking about them. If that's something that you're interested in, then I don't think you'll regret it. If you made it this far, I am extremely thankful that you watched the video, and I genuinely hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day and stay magical.